Welcome back to another edition of the Hart2Heart Podcast. My guest today is Dan Freiheit, also known as Lion Advocacy on Twitter. So this is Dan's second time on the show. So Dan, welcome back, brother.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'm super pumped to chat with you today. You've been pretty vocal on Twitter. I think you're, when you say Lion Advocacy, I think you're really advocating for a lot of people who don't have a voice, say, on the right, or a lot of people maybe who, have been vaccine injured, that kind of thing. So we do appreciate the work that you're doing there today. But also too, you've also been pretty vocal about the Liberal government and, a lot of things that have been going on there. But maybe before we get into it, you can just give the audience a little bit of a brief background about yourself.
Yeah, so Lion Advocacy on Twitter, Lion Law. Professionally, I'm a corporate commercial specialist in Ontario. So I do a lot of corporate commercial work and, a lot of dispute resolution, prevention. I got dragged into the COVID stuff because when vaccines started rolling out in the mandates, I was getting a lot of employment calls and people getting terminated with short notice. And so as part of my work, a lot of employment law and that conflict resolution in that regard. So I was seeing some surprising things in that regard. And that's when I realized there was weird stuff going on. So that's kind of where I started blabbering on Twitter, mainly early 2022.
Nice. Well, I think you've generated, a pretty big audience for yourself. You seem to be fairly active on Twitter and get a lot of engagement. And maybe we'll start there. You had an interesting tweet recently, so I'll just read it back to you. It said, the Canadian government gave 22 million of our own money to the WEF. I honestly can't think of anything worse to waste our tax dollars on. Canada needs DOGE now, or the Department of Government Efficiency. So
was that me? I don't recall writing that.
Yeah, no, I did see that on your Twitter. Maybe I, didn't, maybe I didn't paraphrase it, or, I didn't do it there correctly, but exactly word for word, but it's something like that. So, I guess the question then is like, if Canada did create a DOGE, like what do you think they would find?
I'm going to check that because that's a pretty specific post that I have to double check. If they did create a DOGE, that would, what would they find? There'd be a lot. I mean, we kind of already did expose a lot of wasteful Liberal spending. I mean, I saw it with the ArriveCan as one example, but the Green Slush Fund, it's all over the place. We all know it. We have our own DOGE, just the Canadian people. There's a lot of accounts on Twitter, on X, that have exposed a lot of this frivolous spending, unaccounted spending, as good as or better than a DOGE department would have. So now it's just a matter of, let's crack down and start cutting back. Man, that would save a lot of money.
So you think that then, obviously this program's been created in the States, and there's been a lot of people who have, indicated that there's been a lot of wasteful spending in the United States. And like you said, we have, I guess our own sort of like mini DOGE because there's so many people, active on Twitter and have been able to find out, various different things. But do you think there's anything specific that if we did have, our own kind of Department of Government Efficiency in Canada, that we may find something even deeper? Or do you think that, for the most part, we've already done the heavy digging?
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think a lot. Look, we're getting a lot of information from the Access to Information Act requests, and a lot of the money in there's a lot of discoveries and accounts posting about the GAC and all that stuff. So there is decent transparency, and we're seeing a lot of the wasteful. I mean, I don't know if it's wasteful, but like stuff that folks may characterize as wasteful spending, unaccounted for, unclear what the ROI is. We're seeing it again. It's like it's like doubling down with this new train rail between Toronto and Quebec City, right? Yeah. That'll just be another opportunity for more wasteful spending and unaccounted.
Why do you think that?
I don't think any private business would venture that kind of project. There's no economic sense to it right now. Just the volume of people going between those cities, bouncing around, it just doesn't make sense to invest that kind of money in that kind of project, even though it's cool. It'll, and I would use it personally, but the only way they're going to make that work is by increasing the cost of driving on the highways. And so that's kind of what's irking me a bit. Okay. I've seen this how this government makes projects make sense, and like ArriveCan, give people the choice, but make the alternative extremely costly. In that case, with their freedoms, which is a different element than just their pocketbook. But what they'll do to make that train project viable is just tax the daylights out of drivers. So that's what I'm kind of concerned about.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective because, you said that, it is kind of cool and you would use a service yourself, but you still don't think it's a good idea overall financially.
No, I mean, you've seen how the government, no offense to the provincial government, but like they're trying to do this with the project, the Links project in Toronto. It's proven to be, extremely expensive, more complicated than anybody anticipated. So the government handling these projects, I don't know. That's going to be, it'll be an interesting challenge.
Understood. So, I know you've been pretty vocal about, Mark Carney on Twitter, and, you indicated, and, in one of your tweets, again, kind of paraphrasing here, so I won't read it out completely, but, he did have, he was for the Emergencies Act. He's also supported net zero, which may cause banks to violate antitrust terms. So do you basically see Mark Carney as Trudeau 2.0?
He's probably more effective, and I think he knows the landscape, the banking landscape better than I think Trudeau does. But yeah, in terms of the human rights violation, I wasn't a human rights lawyer before, in my 10, 15 years prior to or COVID, 15, whatever it is, losing track of time. But the blatant human rights violations that everyone's kind of gone quiet on over the COVID stuff. It's irksome. I was never opposed to lawyers fighting for human rights before COVID, and I would have never opposed anything. But like the number of folks who've ingested something, not the vaccine, but like some information pill that are that don't support human rights anymore, so is kind of shocking. And so Carney is a good example where he's kind of just doubled down on his advice with the Emergencies Act. Like, it wasn't right. It wasn't okay. Like, it's not, we're not debating this anymore. I guess we are, because the Federal Court of Appeal now is going to rule on whether that whole thing was justified or lawful. But at least right now, as of today, that was a grotesque violation of rights, banking, human rights, right to protest. And Carney was all for it. And he's just doubling down on that. He's like, now that there's a trade war with Trump, more doubling down on potential violation of using emergency measures. So Trudeau 2.0, fair enough.
Yeah. So you don't really think he would do anything differently than Justin Trudeau? And, I certainly don't want this to happen, but if, he did end up winning the election and becoming prime minister, do you think essentially we'd just be looking at, another 8 years of Justin Trudeau?
What, are we going to have an election and he'd lose it?
I don't know. Maybe not. We certainly had Justin for, I guess, 9 years, So would it be another 4 years of Justin Trudeau, you think?
Okay, I'm not even going to engage in that. There'll be an election at least in the spring, at least in October, and he'll be out by then.
I think so too.
Okay, look, I have no beefs generally with, the Liberal Party took a bit of a shift in the past. I think everybody, even the Liberal voters, agree it's taken a bit of a shift and it's got to come back to normal. If Carney comes in, my concern is that he would kind of see people as more of cogs, more as barcodes / QR codes. He's like, you get to a certain level in banking where you don't see the humans anymore, right? By necessity, just the nature of the job description. And we all have to do that to a certain extent in our jobs. But, I would be concerned that Carney would not really not value human rights the way I think this country needs at this point. That includes all humans, not just unvaccinated or unvaccinated humans.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the whole social credit score and that kind of thing, certainly worries a lot of people. Is that something that you think that he would be for if he got in? Yeah,
I think hands down, like he was the one that supported the banking law, restrictions for the in the convoy. Like, he had no qualms about unplugging people without remorse or without second thought, without review. Like, that's crazy to me. And that's during a time of so-called emergency. But use another emergency to use a similar deplugging system. People are way exceeding their carbon use. Unplug them from the economy. Okay, but now you've sent them down a whole terrible path in terms of what's going to become of their lives now. He doesn't care. We got to save the planet.
Yeah. So that kind of also brings me to the question with regards to like, again, the Emergencies Act and then freezing bank accounts, so like if they froze bank accounts over people donating to the Freedom Convoy, like what do you think they could potentially freeze bank accounts over in the future?
That's a good question. Look, if the Liberals and the NDP are aligned in terms of the dangers of promoting or supporting or saying false things about certain, tech companies or fuel companies, like what would they want to do? Like make it illegal to promote or say misinformation about fuel products, right? About companies that are providing misleading information about the consequences on the environment. So I could see them expanding the debanking or the punishment on anyone who supports things that are harmful or things that are harmful for the environment.
Okay. So basically things that are harmful for the environment you think would be number one, but for most other things you think would be fairly safe, or is it mostly just the environment that you think that they would kind of be after overall?
That's a good question.
Because they do seem to be concentrating on the environment quite a bit.
The environment does seem to be up there in terms of priority. I guess where they would go next is any kind of sense of any influence or working with political enemies. They came down hard on people that took any kind of direct or indirect money from Russia. Anyone who was remotely associated was suddenly, debanked, deplatformed. I shouldn't say anyone, but they went after certain folks in that regard. So just by the smell test, they just didn't like the association, so they unplugged them. So there could be that kind of thing. So you unplugging people that have certain affiliations that are potentially concerning. And look, normally that's okay. In Canada, we've done that before. We just have a more transparent process with hearings. But what they're doing, the administrative state is doing this all without hearings and summarily. And that's where the problem lies.
So I know that you've been pretty vocal about the food banks. Anyway, I've seen you, tweet about it a couple different times. A lot of people are, concerned about the food banks in Canada and how much they've been used. And, based upon what I've seen, the food banks in Canada reported a 32% increase in usage between 2022 and 2023, with over 2 million visits per month in 2023. So do you think this is because of like a global economic crisis, or it's just because of incompetence from the Liberal government?
That's a good question too. I mean, I know a lot of countries are hurting right now, right? So to an extent, I think it is a global phenomenon. I don't know how much the war in Russia, Ukraine is also affecting, the entire food supply. That was a concern a couple of, when this war started. So food shortages are inherently a problem globally. It's not like the governments are helping matters by, with the culling programs, the regulation, the taxes. Like they're not. I don't feel like they're trying to, or that they are succeeding in solving the problem of food affordability as much as they could. But Canada, I think, is a bit unique in terms of what we're seeing and just like on the ground. And maybe you see it more than I do, but because you have a lot of exposure to folks that are really
struggling,
that are struggling, right? And they're coming to you because of that. And to an extent, I get that as well. And it is troubling. And most troubling of all is this kind of just whitewashing it all. When I see the posts by Liberal MPs that how great they're doing and more work to do, keep building. I'm like, no, you've built down. You're digging. Stop digging. Right? There's no build. I mean, I don't see too much of the building right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I kind of find it funny when, liberals say, "Oh, we're doing such a great job." It's like, where are you doing such a great job? Because, I don't really see it. And I think most other people don't see it either, but they seem to just be kind of like pumping their own tires without having any substance to really show for it.
I mean, I think allies, people within the Liberal Party who are getting taxpayer money are doing pretty well. And so they're surrounding themselves with success of their inner circles. Yeah, I don't know that they're getting out there that much to see. I mean, all you have to do is step out of Parliament, turn left, and go down the street there, and you'll see that whatever they're doing is not for certain cohorts is really not working. And they're starting to acknowledge that now. And some of it's provincial as well. Like in BC now, you're seeing a lot of these programs that were designed to take people out of drug addiction made it worse. Like by giving them drugs was just creating a whole other network of criminality. So I think there is some self-awareness and maybe self-correction, but it's slow. It's slow, and it really has to stare them at the face before they take action.
So talking about, opioids and the fentanyl crisis, and you're talking about BC and, the programs that they've implemented. And I think actually the very first place where there was a safe supply program is where I am actually in London, Ontario. But since Trudeau took office in 2015, there have been 50,000 fentanyl deaths. Between 2016 and 2023, there's 42,000 related opioid deaths. And so, what do you think that the Trudeau government has done to contribute to this crisis?
I think I don't know specifically how it works, but I believe a lot of federal funding trickles down. But like what I'm starting to observe is that, and you see it in the U.S., but like a lot of federal money flows through foundations or grants and this, that, and the other. And so it directly and indirectly, I think a lot of the resources have been allocated in trying to solve the problem, and a lot of pressure and lobby groups, are providing information that are supporting some of these safe sites. I don't know what your experience has been with the safe sites. Sometimes maybe in some situations they work, in others they don't.
I'm not really for the safe sites, and I've had several people on this show before, like particular Dr. Sharon Koivu, who's been in the National Post, had a pretty big article there about it. And with addiction, like anything, you want to make the habit more difficult. If anyone's read Atomic Habits before, but by James Clear, one of the things he indicates is to make the habit more difficult. And, the more difficult it is, the more hard it is to access, then the more likely you are to break that habit. But if it's always around, it doesn't matter whether it's junk food or whether it's, an opioid, you're more likely to use. Like one of the first things I tell people when they're trying to lose weight is, just get all the junk food out of your house. And because like, it's not like I have like superhuman willpower. I just don't have any junk food in my house. Like the worst thing I can eat is like a protein bar. I just don't have it in my house. And so I think that really applies to everything, including opioids and including all drugs. And so, by flooding the streets with opioids, I think that it is making everything worse because the access is so much easier for people. And so, it is disappointing to see the Liberal government, fund that particular project, because I do think it's making things worse overall.
Interesting. Right. And look, I've been to some city hall meetings here in Toronto where this is discussed, because Toronto was big on it. And then I think Ford now pulled the plug on a lot of this, and there was a big fight over that. I mean, look, because a lot of folks, their livelihoods depend on these organizations being around. And so obviously they're going to speak up when they aren't funded anymore. But yeah, does it reflect all the data points, all the benefits, costs of these programs? There are definitely stories where someone who would have taken a drug that could have caused, HIV, hepatitis by sharing needles, whatever. Like, yeah, definitely it can help and save certain people. But yeah, it also has a massive cost, and including now we're seeing in BC, this whole underworld of, right?
Are you seeing it much in Toronto in the streets? Because, I haven't been to Toronto much recently. I just don't know if maybe you or some of your colleagues or some of your buddies have, mentioned or had some kind of horror stories about people, using on the street or seeing needles everywhere, or people just kind of strung out in places where they're not, used to seeing them. Have you heard anything like that?
Certain areas more than others. It's a concern, and that was the concern was near schools. They're trying to that was part of the push at the provincial level to make anything near school, any safe supplies near schools, restricted so that it doesn't, so the kids don't see it or it doesn't interfere. But then there's pushback. So it's there. I think they're working on cleaning it up a bit, but it definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, we do need, government to come in and try to do something anyway to kind of like fix this issue because, again, the safe supply program, I don't think has, turned out the way that a lot of people envisioned it to be. And I think that, when they made it, like, I think the people mostly did have good intentions. I thought that they, thought it was going to work, but I also think that unfortunately, I'm not picking on everyone, but there are a lot of doctors who are very, very, very naive, like very, very naive. And, they think that, if you give someone, access to a drug that they're, potentially not going to use other drugs. And it's just not the way that it works, so it's disappointing to see, but hopefully that'll change in the future. But keeping on the same topic of medicine. So, MAiD, medical assistance in dying, this is legal and it's accounted for over 70,000 deaths now in Canada since 2016. So why do you think the government is pursuing this so aggressively? Like, do you think it's compassion or do you think it's just to save money?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think it started off with good, again, like everything, it all starts off with good intentions, but I think it takes out, like it gets taken over. Like the whole idea of MAiD, that's even in my profile on X is like anti-MAiD, because I've heard stories directly from people affected by it, that it's being repurposed and, for budgetary reasons. And I think there was even a federal report on the benefits, the financial benefits of MAiD, because as you know, the cost of care at that, for end of life is where it surges, right? So there's definitely a financial interest for the government to just cut it off. What I'd still like to know, by the way, is how is the effect on insurance policies, if it's considered, how the payouts work in that situation. I'm guessing it, they pay out regardless, but like it doesn't void the policy. But it's troubling, because they're using it now as a financial tool to avoid, to allocate resources for other things, financial resources. Like you look at the GAC, but the global affairs and the money they're spending, where it's going. I mean, look, everybody wants that money for, so it's a matter of like political triage and, health triage. So who should get that money? But when you see some of the frivolous spending, it's like, it really is, it's a heartbreaking, because at the end of the day, it is costing lives we're not investing in things, especially in the cases where the reason for the person chooses MAiD isn't because of physical pain. It's psychological, where they just feel lonely, or they're very, like it's not what was originally contemplated as the reason for choosing MAiD. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like, and I think that, probably when people did initiate this program, they probably did have really good intentions. And, if someone has, Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS or something where, it's very like a slow, crippling death, and you want to, die with dignity, as they say, I can see how someone, may want to choose MAiD. But, when it gets, as you said, like repurposed into other things like mental health, and people saying that, they want to use MAiD when they're 25 years old because they're depressed or something like that, then it gets a little bit slippery, and, what was it really that like really got you on like the anti-MAiD program? Was there a specific story that came out? Like, I know that there was like a CTV did a program. I actually posted it maybe a couple years ago now, and there was this fella who was running out of money essentially, and because he was running out of money, he applied for MAiD because he wasn't going to be able to afford to live where he was going to live. Was it one particular story, or what was it that really got you on sort of the anti-MAiD train?
Well, my mom actually was a volunteer nurse, palliative care nurse, so she spent 20, 30 years dealing with patients in this situation. It was kind of always in the in our upbringing. and having people involved at that stage of end of life care, it minimized, like the physical pain is minimized. It's reinterpreted, I should say, and people can stomach a certain amount of pain when there's care around them, whether it's paid or volunteered. That's why you look at some of the budgetary allocations. That's where I'm like, well, you could help reduce premature deaths by just paying for care or encouraging volunteerism. So that exposure to that, I guess, influence was always in the back of my head. And yeah, I think my mom wrote a book on it. I put it on my Twitter every now and again. What's it called? Life Before Death. And she got a Senate a coin or a commemoration for her work as a volunteer palliative care nurse. So just culturally, wow. I guess.
And so what did she think of the program?
I think she's more or less, we're like on this, I mean, her career was based on providing care. So it wasn't always, ending that care. So I think that was the overall, I think my mom is more okay with, people making that, letting people decide on their own how, what state they can endure. But I don't know. I don't know like the details, like how far that would go, right? Like especially with the mental illness expansion that they're trying to do.
And with regards to like the financial implications, like as you said, there's definitely some financial savings there. Like, do you know any specific numbers or anything like that?
I think it was 150 million, if I'm not mistaken. Was
saved?
Was the annual annual savings? Got to check that.
Okay.
It was quite a bit of change.
Okay. Yeah. Cause I mean, obviously it is going to, save quite a bit of money. So that's where, it kind of gets a little bit dicey. And then the other part too, is when we're expanding it to people who are like, 25 years old who could, still potentially be, incredibly productive people. Lots of people go through really, really difficult stages in their life, but they do turn things around. So, having like, I think an age cutoff or, something, to that effect would probably be really helpful, and I think a lot of people would be on board with that.
Right. The expansion to mature minors was the other real concern that a lot of folks had. Look, and just legally, operationally, how it was implemented is enough to raise some flags, right? Because originally it was expanded, if it was a Carter decision, like by the Supreme Court of Canada on the basis of a basic charter right, like that extending, not allowing people to, who can't terminate their lives early, not allowing them to do so through a third party was unconstitutional. And so that was a Supreme Court of Canada decision, but they expanded it further with this lower court Quebec decision that the government didn't appeal. And so they were just looking for basically it was under Justice Lametti Attorney Lametti at the time was the Minister of Justice who just wanted to really expand the program. And so just the way they did it was unusual, right? Like they didn't, it's unclear which lobby group was so eager to expand this to the point where they didn't want to challenge a lower Quebec court decision to see if that was the law. So it may even be, right? There may be legal issues the way they're expanding it, but we'll have to cross that, bridge.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, in the future we get some, clear answers and we get a really like just a clear guideline as to who is, able to, use this service and who is able to not. And hopefully the people who are able to use it are people who actually need to use it and the people who was intended for it to use when it was, introduced back in 2016.
Right.
So, I know you've been talking about Mark Carney, as we were discussing earlier, and the carbon tax. So, why is it that Canadians are being punished for driving to work, whereas like people in China are not being punished for driving to work while they're emitting, 20 times, 30 times the emissions per day than we are?
This is where it's like you put on your tinfoil hat. You're like, there's like a conspiracy to throw Canada under the bus or something. It makes no sense, right? We are such a small producer of carbon. The folks that are getting punished by this are not necessarily folks that can afford to pay these extra costs. it's ideological. It's an ideological battle we're facing now, that they want, global leaders want the entire global population to make this front and center of their value system. Most clear thinking people, reasonably informed, naturally will try to avoid wasteful, things that hurt the environment just naturally, just by educating them, informing them, to punish them with these taxes that aren't even like being used for, to bring down emissions. Like, yeah, one of my good buddies, very pro, fierce environmental advocate, he's looking at these carbon taxes and he's just like, for him to be opposed to this, like, because they're just taking the money and they're not even investing it or putting it into places where we're going to see tangible results. The goal is to like get people to reduce their use. I mean, people got to use, you got to live.
Yeah.
When it's -40 in Saskatchewan, the tax is just, it's, all the collectors are just,
It just seems like we're being unfairly targeted. And it's so odd because, again, like as you pointed out, like we produce so few emissions compared to other countries like China. I forget the exact figure, but it's something like, 11 to 12 billion. And I forget the exact measurement of it, but like, tons or whatever it is of pollution per year. And ours is something like 0.67 or something like that. Like it's almost like negligible compared to other big countries. And yet we're being targeted and they're not. Like it just seems so odd. It doesn't seem like it's a competent move in any way, shape, or form.
Right. It's a big question in my mind. But look, you got compared to some of the European countries. Because I was looking at this at one point, like, how do we compare? How does this country compare to the taxes that are imposed on, other the smaller European countries? Is there a carbon tax, right? But yeah, it looks like the big winner in all this is, yeah.
So is our carbon tax then higher than, other people or other countries who do have a carbon tax imposed as well?
You've got to look into it. I recall they were like, I don't want to say yes or no, but from what I briefly looked at, I think it was like a chat GPT feeding me the answers. But the concept of a carbon tax was in some of the Scandinavian countries, I think. So yeah, in terms, so Canada, I don't think is necessarily unique. Maybe the rate is higher, or the rate of increase is higher. Certainly, I think, I don't know, like the force that certain MPs or members of cabinets prepared to use does irk me a bit. In terms of, like, I think Ottawa there were some proposals there to create, these 15-minute cities, and the coercive financial force is kind of what irks me in this government now, because I've seen it with COVID. So that's kind of where.
And so what do you think they're doing with this money, like with the carbon tax money? Like, how is that being redistributed? How is it benefiting people?
Trudeau's jets? That's a good question. No comment. We have to get there has to be a good auditor to see where that money is being reallocated. It could be just waste. Like you see some projects that just, like some of these EV projects that don't go, I don't know if they reallocate it to certain other departments within the federal government. Who knows?
So, I didn't actually plan to ask you this question, but just because, we're sort of on the topic there now. Have you ever thought of getting in politics yourself, or getting involved with the government and, trying to create Canada's own, DOGE system or something like that?
I wouldn't say no. You never say never. I'd probably have to restrict my my X account to loyal follow. No, but I think people encourage me to like apply for an ombuds type position or some other I don't know if I would ever want to be voted in. Like that's, you got to play politics, and that's not my thing.
Yeah, I hear you. I don't think I would ever want to do it either, but What Bobby Kennedy is doing, with Make America Healthy Again, I'd love to see that kind of movement in Canada. I don't really see anyone, leading the charge, and doing something like that. But, that's something that I've definitely have, considered, kind of starting or initiating here in Canada. But I just don't know, how much traction I get or how, much I could affect people if I wasn't in government and, wasn't part of it. Maybe there would be some, effectiveness to it, but maybe not. But, sounds like you kind of also want to, make a difference, but maybe not get involved with the government. That's sort of what it sounds like.
Well, and that's why the appointed positions, are kind of a safer bet because you're kind of accountable, but you can operate independently. So, use certain offices in the government, like, the commissioners, information commission, the office of the information commissioner. It's nice to be independent, even though you're paid by the taxpayer, paid by the government and appointed by cabinet, that's the whole point of the office is to be independent. So you don't have to run for government. So, guy like you or me, you see both sides of things. Like you don't seem like, nobody can, I guess certain people could call you an anti-vax doctor, but you don't
I'm definitely not an anti-vax doc, but yeah, I could see why someone would call me that. But yeah,
just because maybe you said some things, I don't know what you've said. I haven't seen your posts on the COVID vaccine, but maybe you weren't entirely, at one point you express skepticism for certain cohorts. Some people might say, oh, anti-vaxxer. Like that's what it came down to with the politicization of even non-political opinions.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, if you weren't on board with everyone getting, both shots and every booster, right on time, essentially you were, dubbed an anti-vaxxer. But if you, said, hey, let's kind of, look at natural immunity. Let's look at like the pros and cons here. Let's look at, different age cohorts, like you said, especially, young men who did have an increased risk of myocarditis, then, you were kind of ostracized and labeled this, crazy right-wing anti-vaxxer. I don't know why right-wing always comes into place when you're trying to evaluate science, but that certainly does. And so, yeah, I mean, it was a very, very odd, situation that we were in back then. And, it's still percolating to some degree even now. But, hopefully with more conversations like this, we can, build some more sanity back into Canada, and that people can, start to make some, just better informed decisions. I just want people to make informed decisions. I don't want people to have to, be mandated into doing something that, they don't want to do, even if maybe it's good for them. I don't want them to be mandated into doing it for them. I'm for freedom.
Yeah, well, that word's taboo. Right. So the informed decision, look, on the legal side, that's where it came up with me. In employment law, my view has always been you can fire somebody at any time for any reason. Subject to the contract, you can always fire people, but you got to give them common law notice. And so it's when they started threatening to deprive people of common law rights, like right to reasonable notice over the vaccine. I'm like, that's not right. Then they're not deciding between two equals. Deciding between two equals means someone with like a 10-year career can get the vaccine, or we're going to terminate you for no notice, without cause. So you know what I mean? So you're presenting a choice to them. It's still not maybe it's unethical, but it's a choice where they're at least informing themselves. There's less coercion when you start depriving someone of a right, or even let's call them privileges that were built into the social contract. That's where informed decision really gets impacted. And that's kind of where I think mistakes were made along the way in this thing.
And so there's so many people on the left who are, just kind of going along with everything. Maybe they have this like go along to get along attitude, but we've seen, government do so many things, in the past few years that have caused restrictions, reduced freedoms, all these kinds of things. Like, what do you think has to happen for people on the left to kind of realize that enough is enough and we need change?
That's a good question. I mean, look, the Canadian flag came back. So they're slowly, they're coming back to Canada. It took Trump to push them into a different, I think it's a slow percolate. I think it's just patience and time, because I think it doesn't sit well now with folks like, just the harsh realities of it. And you're slowly seeing like studies, with the vaccine in non-political or more, more trusted sources, even on the left now, that are showing, testing assumptions. And I think now, so it's basically undermining a lot of fundamental beliefs, I think. And you're really just left with the holdouts, the folks that are just now at this point using pure craziness to dig in their heels, and they're just exposing themselves and they're becoming less and less credible. There's a few folks I can think of online,
like Timothy Caulfield.
I'm like, it's just read the you can start blocking as many accounts as you want, but you're slowly starting to undermine yourself at a certain point by not acknowledging basic reality.
Yeah, I think he's really discredited himself and a lot of other people associated with him as well. But, you just mentioned Trump there briefly. And, one of the things that I did want to chat with you about were like the tariffs. How do you think Canada should handle these particular tariffs? Like, what do you think has been done incorrectly, and what do you think we should be doing moving forward to, build a better relationship with the states, and how should we respond to this overall?
That's a good question. Look, the tariffs were put in on the basis of, what Trump was saying was the problem. There could be I think he has access to information that it's a more complicated motive, but these tariffs and the political disturbance that it's now causing in Canada, because my initial thought was, okay, if the tariffs are there just because Trump is concerned about the border, just solve the border problem. Or if it's the fentanyl, if it's unlawful entry into Canada, okay, just we're all on the same page. But it's looking like Trump has bigger issues with Canada and exactly what he wants, and these incessant jokes about becoming the 51st state. Like, it's hard to figure out exactly what the end game here is. To get to that 51st state, you're just going to have to cause a lot of political instability within this country to get there. And so why is he doing that? Does he have access to information? Is he seeing things within the Canadian Parliament and security threats that a lot of us kind of suspect but don't really have the details on? Maybe. But yeah.
So why do you think he would want us to be the 51st state?
I see a lot of theories floating around on the webs. I think their national security, if Canada is compromised, U.S. is compromised. So, Canada goes pretty far up north, and there's resources up there, and there's threats up there. And I think, Trump is concerned about that. And then, look, as I've said on the X's, on the Twitter, our own parliament has dubious allegiances, and I think that was reported on, right? So I don't know why the U.S. doesn't have that same, potential penetration by the WEF, or if it's just at the state level or municipal level, or but Canada has been compromised in many regards, and so maybe as the 51st state, he sees a way to uncompromise us, or even with these mind games, maybe that's the goal. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I got to say, I did think that, I haven't been following Maxime Bernier too much over the last couple of years, but he did have a really good tweet in response to what he would do. I won't recite everything here, but, I did agree with a lot of the points that he was making. And, I do think that maybe taking his approach would have been, I'm a big supporter of Pierre Poilievre, but I do think that, Maxime did understand the financial implications of that maybe a little bit better. And he did have a really good response for people who, do want to look that up. It kind of blew up on Twitter. So something maybe to for people who are listening, who want to learn more about that they can look up. So say if, worst case scenario, Carney gets in, would you rather it be a 51st state, or would you rather go through Canada and have Carney?
That's a tough question. I think every true Canadian, the idea of being a 51st state is a noxious thought. So, that's not, I don't think that's a realistic option. Look, that being said, as I've said, I'm looking at, it's important to be agile and having a second passport to the United States may be a good option, depending on what happens in this country. As much as you got to stick around and fight for Canadian values, I think having a backup plan is important too. But that's a backup plan. Like that isn't okay. Let's turn over the entire country to the U.S. So I guess if you have to choose between being the 51st state and Carney, I mean, I don't answer that question.
One. Yeah. No, I get it. And listen, I've been, vocal about it, and I've been, ostracized on social media for it because, I did highlight the positives of what would happen if we did become, the 51st state. And, the fact is that, our dollar is terrible. We pay, way too much for gas, way too much for electronics, way too much for so many things. I mean, the cell phone bills in the States are, much lower, than we have here. But, the big downside is, with regards to, medical care. Obviously, we have brutal issues here in Canada. No one can get a family doctor in Ontario. It's just horrific, as you probably know. But at the same time, no one goes bankrupt, generally speaking, over their health in Canada. Whereas in the States, the number one reason for bankruptcy is due to medical bills, which is, something I think that they do need to address. But, I'm of the thought that I'm just open to, learning more. What would it look like if we did become the 51st state, versus not? I want to know like the real pros and cons. And, we know some of them, but we really, I don't think know all of them and what exactly it would look like. Like no one's really laid that out. Like Trump's, hasn't laid that out. I don't know if anyone else has. If they have, and you're listening to this, comment on it and let me know. But as of now, I'm just sort of like open to learning more, and even with that kind of attitude, and also too, I should say that like I do want to give Pierre a chance. I think that he's, worked really hard. I do think he is a stand-up guy. I do agree with a lot of things that he's doing. I think he handles himself extremely well overall. He's very intelligent. I think he has, Canada's best interests in mind. I really want to give him, a chance. But, I do fear that if someone else gets in, like Mark Carney, a lot of people are going to be upset, and a lot of people may actually move to the States or abroad, and we could see a massive brain drain.
Well, and this is the hypocrisy that I'm, even for myself, but like from I see from others, like Canada could never be the 51st state, and then these people go and move to the States. I'm like, okay, well, so what are you leaving then? You're basically just abandoning the ship. It's a tough one. Look, the reality is that the federal government doesn't control everything in the United States. So there's a lot. I mean, maybe we'll see now that they're pulling the plug on a lot of funding. Maybe there'll be some shifts. But you look at a lot that like states like California and New York, and even at the town level, like a lot of daily life is outside the day-to-day functioning of the federal government. And where was it in the States? This guy couldn't even hold up a U.S. flag in a town council meeting because it was considered a prop. You still get idiotic enforcement and restrictions on freedom of speech, even in the States, as part of lawfare. They're like, look, okay, we got some crazy crown attorneys in Canada that are asking for 10 years of jail time for Pat King, and he gets 90 days of conditional sentence. Like, so you get crazy prosecutors north of the border, but like crazy prosecutors in the States, like they're even crazier with some of the stuff they throw. So I don't like 51st state. Okay, freedom of speech, unquote, might be easier, might be better, but there's still, you get down to the local level where there's other ways that they punish people. And
also too, I just think that people maybe, give the government almost too much credence into how much it can influence their own life. Like for the most part, you're still in control of your own life, whether you live in the States, whether you live in Canada. Like I still determine what foods I still determine when I go to bed, what I watch, what I consume, who I talk to, whether I work out or not, all these kinds of things. And so, whether or not you want to become the 51st state or want to stay in Canada, ultimately, the major decisions in your life are up to you. So I don't think that we should, give too much to the government.
So, right. So I agree with you. And that applies to a lot of us who complain about whine and complain about the federal government a lot of the time. Like, well, my daily life, as much as, the federal government's that I don't like a lot of policies. If you look at your day-to-day life, okay, fair enough, right? Like you see it on your, your gas bill, the carbon tax, like, HST, whatever. But like, okay, where that changes, the one thing where the federal government, by the push of a button, is your banking. And that's where that really irked me, that little button that they pressed, that nobody sees how it worked, but that's everything. That was its entire day-to-day life. Your credit. So all the folks that had their banks plugged in February 2022, that alone is just, and yeah, that alone can irk the daylights.
And do you think that something like that would never happen in the States? I mean, you can't say, I guess, say never, but, just significantly less likely.
That's a good question. I guess not at the scale that it happened in Canada and not with the ease. I guess it could. And it's more cumbersome. I guess, look, like a lot of the J6 folks that were, tangentially involved, they really felt the brunt of it. Their lives were, they may have had theoretical access to their banking, but in practice, yeah, it was a more circuitous route to impacting their day-to-day life. So yeah, I guess that's a fair point.
Yeah, I mean, I think the government really can access almost anything they want, like essentially. I mean, I'm sure, or maybe you haven't heard of, like, when Tucker Carlson was trying to set up his meeting with Putin, the government basically got into his account, even though he was on Signal, which is, again, supposed to be one of the more encrypted ways to communicate with people. And they were able to figure out that he was. So I think that,
right.
No matter what, they have access, and I'm sort of right now, like, I know people are like switching over to like flip phones, and they're trying to use VPN Express and all these kind of things to like make sure that no one, gets access to their data or can see what they're doing. But, I don't mean to be, cynical or anything like that, but I just kind of am of the thought that, like, man, if they want to find something on me, they're going to find it, like, no matter what program I'm using, no matter how encrypted you think this particular service is. I mean, maybe I'm wrong on that, but I just got a feeling that I'm not.
No, look, at the end of the day, your two most trusted, or everyone was pitching Proton and Signal. I mean, these platforms were, they have backings that are equally as suspicious or dubious. And there's I would say if people want that kind of assurance, I mean, depending on exactly what they're trying to do, why they would need that kind of secrecy, it's just, you can't really expect it.
Yeah. And, given, everything that's happened over the last few years and, going back even to 2015 when Trudeau was elected, like, say if, I know Stephen Harper was, the man, who was against him at that point, but say Pierre had been in since 2015, or say it was even, Stephen Harper, how do you think Canada would look differently now than it does today? That's
a good question. I feel like a lot of groups are tied to the will of the federal government because of, the different funding and the agendas of the federal government. So maybe you would have seen a different shift in terms of priority, resource allocations, development. It's hard to say because a lot of the federal government's work has been behind the scenes and creating, dividing people and splintering groups with resource allocations. So I don't know if, I associate Pierre Poilievre with a freer kind of economy, and letting different groups and institutions kind of build on their own path. So it's hard. I don't know. It's hard to say. At the end of the day, you had COVID that came in that aggregated power among certain institutions and organizations that would have taken that power even without potentially without the federal government involved. So hard to say. Do you think that people would have been maybe more self-sufficient and less dependent on welfare overall? Yeah, I mean, there's the provincial provincial fund welfare as well, right? I don't know how much people rely on that. I guess in terms of the immigration numbers, Pierre Poilievre is pretty optimistic or aggressive in terms of immigration push. So maybe he there would have been less of a drive there, and in terms of especially for the refugee claims and the costs that has on the federal purse. So maybe Pierre Poilievre, but I don't know how much people rely on the federal government, at an individual level for their day-to-day subsidies, more institutional.
I mean, even talking about like refugees, like, I mean, I had to learn this even the other day when I was in clinic. Like, someone came in who was a refugee and they had like a social worker with them, or a caseworker. And, I was writing them a prescription. They said, can you write me something for Tylenol or ibuprofen? I forget which one it was. I think it was Tylenol. And I said, that's just an over-the-counter medicine. Like, I don't write prescriptions for that. And they're like, oh, because he has a refugee status, he's able to get these medications covered. So it's kind of crazy that, there's certain medications that are covered for refugees that aren't covered in Canada. And I just wonder, that's just, again, one example. But I mean, there's got to be millions of other examples of things that we could bring up that would show that, we're spending a lot of money on, refugees, and we're not giving the same privileges to Canadians. And I think that irks a lot of Canadians.
Yeah. I mean, those are relatively, I would be curious the cost, like how much those programs cost versus other investments, manufacturing facilities for vaccines that kind of turned out to be nothing. Like a lot of these, programs where the money's just unaccounted for. Maybe there would have been less of that under Pierre Poilievre. And also, I guess, just the feeling of justice in this country. Trudeau with SNC interfering in every, his level of specific interference in very basic things like justice. Maybe there would have been more comfort among Canadians with Pierre Poilievre,
And maybe just like less spread of like, the woke mind virus, as a lot of people are calling it. I think Gad Sad may have been the guy who kind of made that term a little bit popular. But I saw there was a reporter, who was questioning Pierre Poilievre maybe a month or so ago, maybe a little bit less, about someone who had committed like 76 crimes and then they were released. And, basically this person was advocating that, like, well, why is he committing these crimes? It's not because there's a criminal, it's because, because of the system and this kind of thing. And it's like, okay, like how many crimes do they have to commit? And like, what do they actually have to do for people to actually understand that, like, we need to have, harder laws on certain people, and to make Canada safer, because, we've seen an increase in particularly car thefts, I think a little bit in violent crimes as well. And, I think that maybe if Pierre had been in instead of, Justin, then we'd have less of this spread of so-called the woke mind virus.
Yeah. I mean, how that impacts the culture in this country, the fear, the community, like how people speak. I mean, it's hard to say because, again, the way it trickles through, because even in Ontario, it's these impacts on folks' expression is really dictated by the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. So it's a provincial matter, not really within federal, but a lot of the conflict I feel is instigated at the federal level, and kind of bumped up in terms of issues that can cause social conflict. If you're constantly making this front and center issue, then it trickles down from federal to all the way to provincial, and so maybe under a different government there could have been more bridge building, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think maybe just kind of like less spread of the woke mind virus, so to speak, in general. I know I only got you there for another few minutes, Dan. So last question I have for you is, should Canada defund the CBC?
I think, look, when I was in university, I liked the CBC at the time. It was a affordable way to get, at the times, relatively, I felt, independent perspectives. So I don't think 100% defunding would be good. I think a bit of defunding maybe, and a bit of review of those bonuses, and maybe promoting a culture of more fearless independence. Something's going on there. There seems to be a culture where, I don't know what it is in the hiring or in who gets promoted, or I guess we saw it with COVID in terms of some of the journalists that couldn't get an opinion out there because of, actually, I'm not sure why, like different perspectives couldn't get in there. But I feel like if, a lot of these organizations do need support to operate. So, and that includes, politically, opposing entities. So I think it's more about just evening the playing field rather than totally pulling the plug on CBC.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think Pierre wants to, pull
He
the
wants to
plug.
plug.
And, I know in the past, so I'm a newfie, but so Rex Murphy, who's, unfortunately has passed away now, but he was, with the CBC for years, but, left in his older years, I think, partly because of, just difference in opinions overall, and maybe not being able to say what he, truly wanted to say on the show. And, we certainly had, vastly different opinions in his last decade of life, maybe his last couple decades, and it is sad to see, some good people like that, who left. And, even Don Cherry, for example, I didn't really agree with him being, booted off. He is, he says some things that, maybe offend people, but like that's what makes him him, and that's what makes him enjoyable to watch, and that's why people always look forward to seeing him on Coach's Corner. So
but he was just kind of he stepped aside. He didn't actually get formally fired, did he? Like,
I'm not sure exactly what happened there, but I think he was formally fired. I think he was formally fired, but I'd have to figure out, or maybe look into what exactly happened. But I think he may have just been formally fired. But, there are examples of people who were, worked for CBC and, did lots of good things for Canadians, but it seems like there's just no room for that now, which is, unfortunate and upsetting for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, look, with funding, comes influence. And so you look in the States, you have the same, I'm curious, there's no federal, news platform in the States, federally funded. I guess the closest thing they have is like state funded, public radio. But yeah, it's a tricky one. I know Pierre is big into defunding the CBC. I don't know exactly what that means. If you go from a budget of, what is it now, over $1 billion to zero overnight, that'd be tricky.
Be very, very interesting to see what happens there.
Right.
Anyways, I know we're kind of going over time there, Dan. So can you just let people know where they can learn more about you, put out your Twitter handle on X, and anything else that you wanted to share?
Yeah, my advocacy, you can find me Lion Advocacy on X or Lion Law. If you Google Lion Law, you'll find me. And any dispute resolution, prevention, that's kind of what I strive for. Awesome.
Well, great having you on the show. Really want to chat with you today, and I think we got through most of the things that I want to chat about. So thanks again for coming on, and thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And as always, I'll be back with another episode soon.